Can everyone see my PowerPoint slide okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Good morning. For my talk, I wanted to talk about the historical backgrounds of residential discrimination that currently impact the forces of gentrification that we're seeing across the state of California and really the nation overall. So there are many places where I could start this conversation, but I think a very relevant one for this panel would be with the New Deal. The New Deal did a lot of good for the United States with respects to showing the responsibility that the government had for its residents. But I think there's no real question that it also contributed to a number of problems. And in particular, I will be discussing the impact of home financing programs from this program that use the percent Black in a neighborhood as direct criteria as investments. This should sound familiar to many here. This is today known as redlining. And these programs, nearly 100 years ago, have had long-term impact on Black neighborhoods across the United States, not just here in California. And this has been widely discussed. What I would like to really highlight here, though, is the consequences of these programs for gentrification. There's a kind of cruel irony here that these programs not only adversely affected the ability of Black communities to build wealth, but would then make them eventually more vulnerable for gentrification, leading to many of the adverse consequences that we associate with this. Specifically, I want to talk about the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. This is a program that came into law in 1933 and existed until 1954. And some of you, I trust, are already familiar with this program, but just to briefly recap, its main objective was to offer refinancing for defaulted mortgages. The government would basically buy up a defaulted mortgage and refinance it at a much more agreeable interest rate. Until this time, there really wasn't a ton of regulation on mortgages and refinancing options and interest rates, so this was a huge policy, and really 20% of American households by 1935 had taken advantage of it. Where this program becomes controversial, though, was that they would use neighborhood characteristics as a mean to establish the suitability of a home for refinancing. And race would play directly into this. You probably are most familiar with the HOLC for these kinds of brightly colorful maps. This is the Pasadena area, although really these maps existed across the state of California. And as I'm sure many of you know already, different colors represent how suitable homes within these places are for refinancing. Greens being the safest investment, red being the least suitable. These would be the areas that we would today consider to be red lines. How these places were kind of classified in this way, the HOLC would empower local teams of assessors to go around. This would be a mix of real estate agents, bankers, politicians, who would use their own knowledge of these neighborhoods to determine how suitable they would be for reinvestment. And based on the policies of the HOLC, they were given a fairly free hand in making these decisions. And what you would ultimately find is that these local assessors would vent their opinions about race and pretty racist views into official government documents. And we can see this because all these neighborhoods come with associating documentation. So here's one neighborhood in the Pasadena neighborhood, neighborhood D7. And to the right, you will see the associating documentation with that. You may or may not be able to read it, but basically what this is showing is mostly fairly mundane stuff. Vacancy rate of the neighborhood, the average household size, the average home value, the kind of things you would expect in this kind of process. You may also notice near the top right of the screen, it also asks for the percent, or at the time, Negro. And if we go to the bottom of this document, it actually provides more explanation for this. This will probably be not legible, so I went ahead and zoomed in. So what it says is, this area is favorably located, but is detrimentally affected by the 10 owner-occupant Negro families located in the center area going on. Although the Negroes are said to be of better class, their presence has caused a wave of selling in the area, and it seems inevitable that home ownership and property values will drift to lower levels. This area is accorded a high red solely on account of the racial hazard. So this is really telling. A neighborhood that, by the admission of the assessors, is favorable is being devalued principally because of its Black population. And where it's important to mention middle and arguably upper middle class Black residents. Not all the forms are this verbose, but even the plainer ones are still quite telling. So here's the next neighborhood a few blocks over, neighborhood D6. This district was originally much smaller, but constant infiltration into other sections as deed restrictions expired has created a real menace, which is greatly concerning property owners. So by deed restrictions, what they mean is until 1948, it was perfectly legal for householders to band together, create these legally binding documents wherein they could not sell their homes to people of color. It's what we would know as racial covenants. And so what this is telling us is that covenant has expired. Black people are moving into the neighborhood, and this is why they're going to devalue it. So two situations where a neighborhood is potentially going to be denied investment in the form of refinancing solely because of its race. Now, there are many consequences from this form of redlining that have been unpacked. The effect on the ability to build wealth because you have to pay less favorable rates, how this worked in conjunction with other forms of residential discrimination, largely trapping of people of color into these neighborhoods. This has all had long-term consequences. And you can see this looking at cities in the state nationwide, across the state. So I have here broken down by the grade provided by the HLSE, the percent Black over the years. So starting with 1940, onwards to 1980, and then to 2019. And you can see that the C and D grade areas have the largest share of Black residents in cities across the state of California. This program had a direct influence in shaping this. And we can see this. So going back to Pasadena, what you are seeing here is the information from before, but digitized. So we have the redlined areas, the grade D areas, and also the grade C areas highlighted. This was done by researchers over at the University of Richmond who have made this data publicly available. And I've overlaid this onto 1940 demographic data, the percent Black of the time. And you can see that there's really only one area that has a sizable Black population that's really noticeable then. But if we were to jump ahead to 1980, you can see that the increase of the Black population has largely corresponded to where these grade C and grade D areas are. But what's not important is not just this influence, but the story continues and takes some interesting turns. So if we go to 2019, you can see that the Black population in the Pasadena area has expanded somewhat, but the concentrations have declined. This is not something you would only see in the Pasadena area. If you look at historically Black communities across the state, there have been dramatic declines in the concentration of Black residents. You may recall from before, let me just go back for a moment, that the Black populations of California have roughly halved from 1980 to 2019 with respect to their representation in neighborhoods. Many would argue that this is an expression of gentrification. Now, this raises an important question. How would historic redlining relate to gentrification? Well, there are at least two types of paths that this can relate. First, gentrification can directly influence long-term gentrification by undervaluing neighborhoods. So if a neighborhood is being undervalued purely because of the race of the people who reside within, what that means is, like all other criteria, the neighborhood should be fairly decent in terms of the homes, the housing, everything else. But they're experiencing an undervaluing that exists otherwise. And this gap between what the existing value of a home is versus what it could be is something that we know as the rent gap. And the bigger the rent gap, the more appeal a neighborhood will have for would-be gentrifiers. Because an area with a very large rent gap means a huge potential profit margin. So on this front, redlining has a very direct association with potential gentrification by shaping the places that have a big rent gap. But also, gentrification can indirectly relate to eventual gentrification as well. So, as we've already established from all the research that's been done, historic redlining affects where communities of color will live over the future. And what has happened over the last few decades is these areas have become increasingly appealing for gentrification. There's a number of explanations for this. One in particular is that city and state officials have tried to make these neighborhoods more appealing for redevelopment in conjunction with local redevelopers. The point being, though, is the historic redlining has influenced what we are seeing today. And we can look back at Pasadena or other places across the state and see that looking at where gentrification has started by different decades, it largely corresponds to the areas that have been historically that were historically redlined. There does appear to be a relationship here. And we can look across the state and see that the areas that tend to gentrify are largely overrepresented into areas that are grade C or D across all the different time periods we have data available for, to the point that by the 2010s, roughly 50%, a little bit more really, of grade C or D areas have started gentrifying. So we've established that there appears to be a link between historic redlining and contemporary gentrification. What are the consequences? Many people will be discussing this today, so I'll keep this brief. I have, however, done extensive research on gentrification and health consequences that I think would be relevant here. When we want to understand the consequences of gentrification, there's really two groups that we can think about. First, there are those who have been displaced. Now, there's much that we can be said about the effects of displacement and gentrification. The increase of those who are unhoused, the economic cost for relocation for those who are able to find new housing, more subtle things like the loss of a sense of community identity that you had in the place that you lived, the loss of existing social networks. All of this can have adverse effect on one's well-being. But we also have to think about those who have not necessarily been displaced, those who are able to remain in these neighborhoods. This group has not always received the same amount of attention, but there are consequences for what they are experiencing as well that are worth discussing. Even if you're not in any real immediate danger of being displaced, it doesn't mean you won't fear that as a future possibility. And there's research that I have conducted and others have conducted that have shown that gentrification is associated with what we would call anticipatory stress, the anticipation that it will happen. This is a huge stressor. And also, you can still feel isolated. You might be in a situation which we have seen in many places across the state, and the demographics that I've shown you before suggest that you'll be in a neighborhood where the people become different and the stores become different, to where you can become a stranger in your own community. This can be a source of stress as well that's worth considering. However, I would like to close by stressing the potential of gentrification to be an opportunity. Let's keep in mind here that at its heart, gentrification, the reintroduction of middle and upper income people into previously deprived areas, may in some ways correct the disinvestment that the government is responsible for through historic redlining. And indeed, if you look at different studies, local residents of gentrifying neighborhoods can improve a lot of the changes that have taken place. New sidewalks, new street lamps, stuff like that. But the problem is, it's not necessarily equitable to everyone who resides within a community. I would argue, and many of my colleagues would also argue, that through the right government intervention from the government, gentrification can be used as a useful force for all who reside in a neighborhood. But again, the key here is through the correct intervention. Now, I was asked, what do I see reparations as? And personally, I would see them as the government taking responsibility to right its past wrongs through a direct and very fiscal sense. And I can think of largely two areas based on what I've discussed so far that this can be done. So with gentrifying neighborhoods, the first step is to give Black residents a stake in these neighborhoods as they change. There are a number of paths that this can be accomplished. I would argue that an important one is fostering locally Black-owned businesses. And this can be accomplished through methods like low-interest loans, directly given to would-be business owners in these areas. A business presence can help mediate local issues, advocate for local things that these neighborhoods may be. So it gives us a really direct stake. Secondly, we need to give local residents in these areas a sense of security that they're not going to be displaced. So one way that this can be done is through direct cash-based assistance to help manage housing costs for areas that are seeing dramatic increases in their home costs. Now, this can be done for homeowners, and there are some measures that exist, but I think it's really imperative that we also think about renters. So are there direct cash-based assistance programs that could be targeted directly towards Black renters in gentrifying neighborhoods? The overall goal is to give the residents in these neighborhoods a sense that they're not going to be pushed out right away, to kind of alleviate the sense of stress and fear. Gentrification can be used in a useful way with the right intervention. So to surmise, Black neighborhoods across the state have experienced a form of historic redlining, which directly took into account the racial and ethnic concentrations of these neighborhoods, which has had adverse long-term effects on these communities, which, in a cruel, ironic twist, has made them more appealing for eventual gentrification. Areas that were once written off because of their racial characteristic are now becoming inaccessible for these very same people as a result of gentrification. And reparations are a way for the government to take responsibility for its complicity in this process to right these past wrongs. I would like to thank the research assistants for my graduate students, Tabitha Page and Katie Brandy, and also the Mapping Inequality Project for making the University of Richmond for making this data available to me. Thank you very much.